to our second STOA Talk of the Fall 2020 semester. So today speaking, we have Vanessa Purcell. She is a history major with a double minor in geography and museums, or public history and museum studies. And today she's going to be presenting about historical preservation in a rural town.
Hello, everyone. Like Ashley said, my name is Vanessa Purcell, and this is historic preservation in a rural town. This is a project I'm really passionate about. I actually worked on this the entire summer. So I got back from a short vacation, and then pretty much as soon as I got back, I started working on this project. And so it's been a pretty major part of my life for the past 6 months, and I'm really excited to present to you guys on all of this because I think that it's something that not a lot of people talk about, because we always hear about historic preservation in places like Boston or New York City or Kansas City or St. Louis, but we don't talk about it a lot in these real spaces. But before we get into the preservation side of things, we first need to talk about where it is and how I came upon this project. And to do this, I'm actually going to tell you guys, I'm actually going to tell you guys a story. So up here, we see Sanborn, Missouri, just 30 minutes southeast of here in Gentry County. I moved there when I was 8, so I have considered this town my hometown because it's where I've spent most of my life. And growing up, I was surrounded by all of this history because the town was built in 1879 when the Wabash Railroad extended that way. So essentially, this town was built out of necessity, if anything. And I think that that's super fascinating because we hear all these towns being built for miscellaneous reasons, and a lot of this history goes away, but in Stanberry, it stayed just because they don't have the funding to build these new buildings, or they just have decided not to rebuild. And I think it's super interesting. And so then we flash forward a little bit to my junior year of high school, and I'm taking Western Civ 2. And for whatever reason, we're talking about Stanberry. I don't know why we were talking about Stanberry, Missouri in European history class, but we were. But my instructor showed us these pictures of Stanberry not long after Stanberry was built, probably about the mid-1880s. And it was of the square, so the exact area that I ended up working on. And there was these gorgeous brick streets and these old tall buildings and what the park used to look like and the train depot, just all of this wonderful stuff. And I remember sitting there thinking, why doesn't it still look like that? Why has this part of our history not been preserved? And obviously things change. I don't expect us to have brick streets anymore. I don't expect everything to look the exact same. But I was still wondering why it was so different, why there was no one who had decided to take the initiative to preserve our history. So then with another little flash forward, I'm at Northwest with the public history minor, and I have to do 5 credit hours worth of internship for my minor. I'd already done 4, so eventually I decided to do 1 credit hour for historic preservation. So just 1 credit hour over the summer. I talked to Dr. Ford, and from then we started. And initially I decided to do a historic district. I did not end up achieving historic district forms and such, which is something I will get to later. But the building that was my main focus, you can see at the bottom of the screen, which is called Big 4 Hardware. Big 4 Hardware was actually built right around the same time that Stanberry was platted, and it's always been the site of a hardware store since. It is the only hardware store in Stanberry, and is one of the only hardware stores in the area. So essentially, Big 4 has been serving Stanberry and a good portion of Nottoway County for over 100 years, which to me is actually kind of awesome because this is a locally owned, a small hardware store that is continuing to do great things and to help the community. So we have our location, we have the idea, but then there's the issue of where do I start? how does one start the historic district / building process? I used multiple forms of research tools, with one of my first ones being what's called Sanborn Maps. For those of you who don't know, Sanborn Maps are a collection of maps usually used by fire insurance companies. They're really common during the 19th to 20th centuries. So they're extremely detailed and they're a great source because they're actually really easy to find. A lot of times you can find them on the University of Missouri website. This one here is for the area in Stanbury I was working for, with Big 4 actually being this top portion of the map. So this was a great source because I was kind of able to look around and I was able to find these records of Big 4 and these other buildings being around during the late 19th century. Another great source that I used was newspaper articles. As we all know, newspapers are a great way to find history and to find records. And so here I actually have newspaper articles from 3 different points in Stanbury history. First, we have this one from 1909, where at Big 4 you could buy plain and fancy screen doors. So it's all of your door needs. Up here, or over here, excuse me, we have an article from 1957 where you could get a 40-piece ovenware set if you bought a dishwasher. And then finally up here, we have an article from 1979, so about 100 years actually after Stanbury was platted. And it's when Big 4 was sold to the Lockharts, which is the family that actually still owns Big 4 today. And I submitted these newspaper articles as part of my initial form because it shows that Big 4, or whatever it used to be called when it first opened, was still open, and it was still running and still serving the community. So it helps show the significance of the area. And then next, I also used historic inventories and architectural surveys. So this is one actually done by Tom Carneal in the 80s with his class. He did one for many of the surrounding counties in the area, and this is actually what sparked my interest in doing it for Stanbury and Big 4 hardware. And this historic inventory was actually probably one of my most helpful aids, because when looking at this piece of paper, you find the location, the style that it was built, when it was built, the foundation material descriptions. You basically find everything that you're going to need for that initial process. And that was super useful because it was essentially laid out all for me and was a great layer to begin. So I was really grateful that I had this inventory from Tom because it really helped with getting everything started and finding out where to go next. A couple of other sources I used was a book called Once Upon a Railroad. This is a book written specifically about Stanbury, Missouri, for the Missouri Centennial. It was written by a group of people from Stanbury, so it's not written by historians, but community members, which is really fascinating because it was the stories of people who had grown up there, who had spent their lives there. And it provided a lot of pictures and a lot of great general background source, which I really loved. I also spoke to my peers. So I have a peer of mine who graduated not too long ago, who did a historic preservation project as well, and his was actually successful. So I had met with him in order to figure out what I should do and where I should go, because a historic preservation process is quite unlike any other project or process that many of us have done before. And then alongside that, I also just had discussions with people from Stanbury. So if it was some Sunday morning and my dad needed to get his hair cut, we'd go to the barber shop in Stanbury and I would talk to this 80, 90-year-old barber about what Big 4 in that area used to look like. And he was able to provide this great context because through talking to him, I found out that there used to be a dentist's office on the top floor of the building, or that the building next to it used to be a five and dime store, and all of this other great info that sometimes isn't always the easiest to find in these small towns. Which then, that actually takes me to the next part, which is bumps in the road and other mishaps. Because what would be a presentation or a project without something going wrong along the way? And the things that kind of went wrong was a nice variety. And some of them were foreseeable and others weren't. So this was definitely a learning experience for me. The first was the city government. So many members of the city government were often unavailable. There were some bumps in the road with the city planner. The mayor had bigger things to worry about than helping a college student with her summer internship, which I don't blame him. So I was finding a lot of this history on my own. They were able to help me with some baseline basic knowledge, and they did direct me to some stuff. So I'm grateful for what help they were able to give me, but it definitely wasn't the easiest because they had a lot of other things to do. And of course, summertime, construction, farming, all of those other big important things that are happening in this small area. Another issue I had is in Stanberry, there really isn't any preservation happening. There is no buildings in the city of Stanberry that are on the National Registry. And then in Gentry County, where Stanberry is, there's only about 4. So not a lot of people in Stanberry really understand the National Registry. I would walk up to people and ask them, oh, I'm trying to get this building on the National Registry. And I just kind of get it, or what? Some blank stares, some question marks, just some general confusions, which once again, I don't blame them at all. But also with that, there's no Gentry County Historical Society or a museum, a central museum in Gentry County. There's some smaller ones specific to other towns, but they didn't really have a lot of information specific towards especially Stanberry. The closest thing they had was a genealogical center at the Gentry County Library, which is close, but not quite the same thing. And with that, there was also not an archivist or historian at the Gentry County Library. So they had some experience using the research materials and microfilm business records, things such as that. But once again, a lot of it I had to do on my own because they still just struggled because at the Gentry County Library, they focus more on moving forward, new programs, new ways to find funding, things like that, when I was looking at the past. And so that was definitely a point of difficulty for me because it was hard to find people who kind of understood what I was doing. And then I sent in a preliminary form to the State Preservation Society of Missouri. This form basically determines whether or not the buildings I was working with would be eligible for a historic district. And I got an email 2 days later that said that I should do a historic building instead, which means that I had to essentially change my focus. The reasoning for this is because when you do a historic district, you take every single building in the row and kind of zoom in. You evaluate every single building. And through this picture here, not every single building is eligible because there's a building missing, first of all, and then there's an entirely new set of buildings built. So that means that if I try to apply for the historic district, it would essentially just get rejected, which was unfortunate, but I'm happy for the guidance that I was able to receive. And that just meant that I had to focus on a historic building, which, like I said, not a bad thing, but I just had to take an even closer look at the building. And the ironic part is actually Dr. Ford and I had discussed doing a district because it thought that we would have better luck. So hindsight is 20/20, I guess. And so that's kind of where we are now, actually, is I turned in a second preliminary form for a historic building instead of a historic district, but I have yet to hear back. I worked on that until probably the beginning of August, end of July. Once I hear a response, I will make the needed changes. So after this preliminary response, it's kind of like a rough draft. So if she says I need more pictures or more details or something, I will fix that. And then maybe after a couple more rounds, that's when I'll submit my official application. The official application is a lot more work though, which I am ready for the challenge. It is a 10-page document that requires the longitude and latitude of the building, for floor plans, in-depth writing, multiple pictures, just a lot more in-depth information. So it's, like I said, taking that scope and kind of zooming in. But it's something that will definitely be exciting, and I can't wait until I hear back. But as a whole, for how this project affected me personally, this was an internship unlike any others that I've done before. I have done an internship in a museum, in the archives, but this was definitely different. It was almost like an independent study where I was working by myself for a lot of it, but it was definitely fascinating. And it made me realize a lot about Stanberry, and it made me hopeful for Stanberry, because I'm hoping that if I do achieve the status of historic building, that it will set a precedent for Stanberry, because I have seen all of these buildings and I see them crumbling or needing all of this work. And if I achieve the status for one building, it can then apply for grants and other forms of awards in order to rebuild and keep it up to the glory that it once was. And I love the thought of that, because why not take this historic, beautiful town and turn it into something great? But then, on a lighter note, there was also the side of it that I loved, which was combining the two favorite parts of my academic career: maps and old things. I personally thought that that was great, because I was taking the historical GIS, the public history, just the general like Nodway County, Missouri history of it all, and combining it all into this project that I felt truly passionate about. And I really hope that I am able to achieve this status, because there's just something wonderful about something that I put so much work into, achieving this official status. And I wish that I could give you guys a direct answer, but unfortunately, that's not always how the bureaucracy works. So I'm hoping that soon I will hear an answer, and I will keep you all updated. But for now, that is all I have. Thank you.
Questions? Aside from print, were there any other forms of media that you used to conduct your research?
Not really as a whole, just because with the way that a lot of historic preservation works, you have to do it at least like 30 to 40 years behind, and there weren't really a lot of videos. It was mainly just print resources, and I guess me physically going out to Stanberry, but I don't know if you would consider that a resource. But
have you like calculated like how many more buildings like theoretically in Stanberry could achieve this status?
So actually, with the historic inventory that I initially looked at, there was about 4 other buildings that I thought about doing, which included the former mayor's house, an old movie theater, and a couple of others. So at least 4. And I'm sure that there's many more, but the big thing is Stanberry has started to consistently change their infrastructure. And that includes changing buildings, taking away the top story of buildings, for example. So I just, as of right now, more than 4, but who knows in the next year or so.
What do the owners of the hardware store think about this?
So I actually know the owner personally. He was a neighbor of my parents when we lived there, and he thinks it's a great thing as well because of all of these grants that he can apply for, and also the fact that it would then be considered a historic building. It's kind of something that would put Stanberry and the store on the map, literally.
Okay.
Let's see.